The marble hall of the assembly was packed, yet the air felt thin, drained of sound by 1,000 waiting lungs. Paul stood at the center of the dais. He did not look at the faces watching him. He looked at the scroll in his hands. The parchment was dry, stiff, and made a sharp cracking sound as he pulled the edges apart. The noise echoed against the stone walls, cutting through the silence like a blade. He gripped the wood rollers, his knuckles white, and held the text open. He did not offer a greeting. He did not seek approval. He planted his feet, drew a breath that seemed to pull the focus toward him, and spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that pushed against the rafters. "The gospel," he began, "reveals the righteousness of God." He paused, letting the words hang in the stagnant air. The assembly shifted. Some leaned forward, expecting a message of comfort or a promise of peace. Paul kept his eyes fixed on the scroll, his stance immovable. He had set the standard. There was no turning back from the claim. Paul lifted his hand, pointing toward the high, arched windows where the sky burned with the afternoon sun. He argued that the invisible qualities of the Creator, his eternal power and divine nature, were clearly seen. They were understood through the things that had been made. The sun, the stars, the very structure of the earth stood as an undeniable witness. He lowered his hand, his fingers curling into a tight fist as if holding something small and fragile. Then, he described the pivot. Instead of acknowledging the majesty above, humanity reached down into the dust. They took wood and stone, shaping them with their own hands. They traded the immortal for the mortal. It was a calculated, deliberate exchange. Paul paced the dais, his movements sharp and restless. He spoke of the majesty of the heavens, then gestured to the floor, contrasting the infinite with the finite. The crowd watched. They had turned their backs on the light to worship the work of their own fingers, initiating a descent that would leave the world fractured. Paul stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still, his gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with those in the front rows. He spoke of the darkening of hearts, a process that began with a choice and ended in a void. As they abandoned the truth, the light within them flickered and died. Then, he delivered the most chilling part of his account. He described a divine release. God did not strike them down. He did not force them to stay. Instead, he let go. He gave them over to the very desires they had prioritized above the Creator. Paul's voice dropped, becoming a low, resonant warning that vibrated through the floorboards. The restraint was removed. The boundary was lowered. He described the moment as a withdrawal of the hand that had held the world in order. Without that anchor, the structure of their lives began to fray. The crowd remained motionless, the air in the hall growing heavy and stagnant. They felt the shift, a sudden, terrifying sense of being left to their own devices. Paul watched them, his expression unyielding, as he painted the picture of a humanity untethered. It was not a punishment inflicted from the outside. It was the natural, devastating result of their own pursuit. The order they relied upon was dissolving, and in the silence that followed his words, the reality of that abandonment settled into the room like a cold fog. Paul began to pace again, but his steps were no longer measured. They were sharp, aggressive, cutting through the space between him and the assembly. He started to list the symptoms of a world unmoored. "Envy," he declared, biting the word out like a jagged stone. "Pride," he spat, gesturing toward the chests of the men in the front row. "Deceit," he whispered, his voice carrying to the back of the hall. He did not describe these as distant threats, but as a contagion currently coursing through the room. He pointed to the way neighbors looked at one another, the way hands clenched when a rival spoke, the way eyes darted to hide a secret. He stopped directly in front of a man in the center aisle, holding his gaze until the man looked away. Paul turned back to the assembly, his hands open, palms up, as if presenting a mirror to them all. This was not a report on a foreign land. It was a catalog of their own daily habits. Impurity had spread like rot through the foundation of their lives. and he laid it bare with clinical precision. He watched as the realization dawned on them, the shifting of feet, the sudden avoidance of eye contact. Paul stepped back from the center of the room. He did not close the scroll. He left it spread wide across the wooden lectern, the ink stark against the parchment, a permanent record of the indictment. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, pressing down on the shoulders of every person in the hall. He stood still, his hands resting at his sides, watching as the weight of his words settled into the floorboards. No one moved. No one spoke. The air felt thin, stripped of the excuses they had carried in with them. By exposing the depth of their need, Paul had removed the floor from beneath their feet. He simply stood there, leaving them to face the void they had created.